6 weeks into sustained military operations against Iran, the United States has lost 4 senior commanders, not to enemy fire, not to accidents or illness, to resignation and relief from duty. 3 admirals have submitted retirement papers citing irreconcilable differences with operational directives. 1 Marine general was relieved of command for what the official statement called a failure to execute lawful orders. The uniformed leadership of the campaign is fracturing, and the cracks are visible to anyone paying attention. Rear Admiral James Malloy was the first to go. As commander of Carrier Strike Group 5, he was responsible for the USS Ronald Reagan and its escort vessels operating in the Western Pacific and Arabian Sea. 2 weeks into the operation, Malloy received orders from Pacific Fleet Command to reposition the carrier group closer to the Strait of Hormuz, reducing the standoff distance from 400 kilometers to 80 kilometers from the Iranian coast. The tactical rationale was clear. Closer proximity would allow FA-18 strike aircraft to reach targets deeper inside Iran without requiring aerial refueling, increasing sortie rates and reducing mission complexity. But Malloy's analysis of the threat environment led him to a different conclusion. At 80 kilometers, the carrier would be well within range of Iran's Fatah-2 hypersonic anti-ship missiles, which intelligence assessments indicated had an effective range exceeding 1,400 kilometers. The Aegis defense systems aboard the strike group's cruisers and destroyers could not reliably intercept hypersonic threats. Moving the carrier closer would not enhance combat effectiveness, it would increase vulnerability without corresponding operational gain. Malloy submitted his assessment through official channels, recommending that the carrier maintain its current position until either the threat environment changed or defensive capabilities improved. The response from higher command was unambiguous. The order stood. The carrier would move forward as directed. When Malloy requested clarification on acceptable risk thresholds and rules of engagement in the event of hypersonic missile attack, he was told that those decisions would be made at the theater level and that his responsibility was to execute the positioning order. Malloy drafted a written response. In measured but direct language, he stated that he could not in good conscience move 5,000 personnel and a $13 billion strategic asset into a threat zone where survival depended on an adversary choosing not to fire rather than on any defensive capability under his command. He acknowledged that the decision constituted a refusal to obey orders and submitted his request for retirement effective immediately. The retirement was accepted within 48 hours. No public statement was issued. Malloy was replaced by his deputy, who executed the repositioning order without objection. The carrier moved to 80 kilometers offshore. No Iranian missiles were launched. But the precedent was set. A senior officer had resigned rather than follow orders he considered operationally unsound. Rear Admiral Sarah Chen commanded Destroyer Squadron 50, a formation of guided missile destroyers operating in the northern Arabian Sea and approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Her resignation came 3 weeks into the campaign, triggered by updated rules of engagement that she believed violated international maritime law and created unacceptable risk of civilian casualties. The updated ROE directed U.S. warships to treat all large commercial vessels transiting the strait as potential threats unless positively identified as friendly through multi-source intelligence. Ships displaying suspicious movement patterns or failing to respond to radio challenges could be engaged with warning shots and, if the threat persisted, with lethal force. The directive was a response to intelligence indicating that Iran had converted numerous oil tankers into covert missile platforms. But Chen's read of the directive was that it authorized preemptive strikes against vessels that might be civilian based on criteria that were subjective and difficult to verify in real time. Chen requested legal review of the ROE through the Judge Advocate General's office. The response confirmed that the directive had been reviewed and approved at the Department of Defense level. Chen then submitted a formal objection, noting that the criteria for engagement could easily result in the sinking of a legitimate commercial vessel with international crew, triggering a diplomatic and humanitarian crisis that would undermine the broader strategic objectives of the operation. Her objection was noted and rejected. The ROE remained in effect. Chen was directed to implement the procedures across her squadron and ensure all commanding officers understood the engagement protocols. She submitted her resignation the following day. Her statement, later obtained by media outlets, read in part, "I cannot order sailors under my command to fire on vessels that may be civilian based on ambiguous threat indicators. This directive places us in violation of laws of armed conflict and exposes the United States to legal and moral liability I am unwilling to bear." Vice Admiral Robert Torres, Deputy Commander of the Fifth Fleet, resigned after a dispute over casualty reporting and strategic assessment. Torres had been tasked with compiling weekly summaries of operational losses, equipment damage, and mission success rates. His reports painted a picture that contradicted the public narrative being presented by Pentagon spokespeople. 8 aircraft had been lost. 14 sailors killed in action aboard the USS Porter. 2 destroyers damaged and withdrawn from theater for repairs. Sortie rates were declining due to maintenance issues and crew fatigue. Target destruction assessments indicated that many high-value objectives remained intact despite repeated strikes. Torres submitted these reports through classified channels to Central Command and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He also included strategic assessments suggesting that current operations were not achieving decisive effects, and that continued attrition at current rates would degrade readiness without corresponding progress toward defined objectives. The response he received was not a request for additional analysis or a discussion of alternative strategies. It was a directive to limit distribution of his reports and to revise future assessments to align with approved messaging frameworks. Torres interpreted this as an order to suppress accurate casualty and effectiveness data in favor of narratives that supported continuation of operations regardless of actual results. He refused. He expanded distribution of his next report to include members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, bypassing the chain of command. Within 24 hours, he was informed that his retirement would be processed immediately. He accepted without protest. Major General David Crawford's removal was more abrupt and more public. As commanding general of a Marine expeditionary force, Crawford was ordered to prepare for the deployment of 5,000 Marines to forward operating positions near the Iran-Iraq border. The mission profile called for establishing a presence that could support potential ground operations, though no specific operational plan had been provided. Crawford's staff conducted logistics assessments and determined that the proposed deployment lacked adequate air support, supply chain infrastructure, and medical evacuation capability. Crawford presented these findings in a video conference with CENTCOM leadership, concluding that the deployment as outlined would place Marines in a position where they could neither accomplish a defined mission nor withdraw safely if attacked. He requested clarification on the strategic objective, the expected duration of the deployment, and the support assets that would be allocated. The response was that those details were being finalized, and that his responsibility was to prepare his forces for deployment on the directed timeline. Crawford's response, recorded in the video conference and later leaked to media, was direct. This order is not supported by military logic or operational necessity. I will not move Marines into a position where they are exposed without purpose and without the means to defend themselves or accomplish a mission that has not been articulated. He was relieved of command within 24 hours. The official statement cited failure to execute lawful orders and loss of confidence in his ability to command. He was replaced by a colonel who immediately began preparations for the deployment. The Marines moved to their assigned positions. The strategic objective remained undefined. 4 senior officers, 4 resignations or reliefs, all within 6 weeks. The pattern was unmistakable. Experienced commanders with decades of service were concluding that the orders they were receiving were strategically incoherent, tactically unsound, or legally questionable. And rather than execute those orders, they were choosing to end their careers. The immediate effect was operational. Each departure required a replacement, and replacements were inevitably less experienced. Institutional knowledge was lost. Continuity was disrupted. But the deeper impact was on morale and trust within the officer corps. Junior officers watched senior leaders resign or be relieved for questioning orders. The message was clear: compliance was valued over judgment, obedience over analysis. Officers who raised concerns about strategy or tactics were not engaged in dialogue. They were removed. This dynamic created a selection pressure. Commanders who survived were those who accepted orders without objection, regardless of their private assessment of those orders' merit. The result was a leadership cohort increasingly composed of officers willing to execute directives they might privately believe to be flawed, simply because dissent carried career-ending consequences. Congressional response was swift but divided. Members of the Senate Armed Services Committee requested testimony from Torres, who had provided them with casualty reports that contradicted official Pentagon briefings. His testimony, delivered in closed session but later summarized in public statements, described a pattern of strategic confusion, unclear objectives, and mounting losses that were not being accurately reported to Congress or the public. The political fallout was immediate. Media coverage focused on the disconnect between Pentagon public messaging, which emphasized progress and operational success, and the private assessments of senior commanders who were resigning in protest. Public opinion, already divided on the operation, became more skeptical. Polls showed declining support for continued military engagement and increasing calls for congressional oversight. Within the Pentagon, the resignations were treated as disciplinary matters rather than strategic warnings. Official statements emphasize that the military chain of command requires obedience to lawful orders and that officers who cannot execute those orders are appropriately relieved. There was no public acknowledgement that the departures might reflect legitimate concerns about strategy, tactics, or legal compliance. Privately, conversations among remaining senior officers reflected deep concern. The willingness of multiple flag-rank officers to resign rather than comply suggested that the problems were not isolated incidents of personal disagreement, but systemic issues with the conduct of the operation. But those concerns were not being elevated to decision-makers in a way that prompted strategic reassessment. Instead, they were being suppressed, and officers who voiced them were being removed. Historical parallels were noted by military analysts and historians. The pattern resembled dynamics observed during Vietnam, where field commanders increasingly questioned the strategic coherence of operations even as political leadership insisted on continuation. The resignation of senior officers during that conflict, while less common than in the current situation, reflected similar tensions between military judgment and political directive. Iran, monitoring these developments through both intelligence channels and open-source reporting, recognized the opportunity. State media highlighted the resignations as evidence of American strategic disarray and weakening resolve. The narrative presented to domestic and regional audiences was that the United States military leadership itself doubted the mission, and that continued resistance would force further fractures in command cohesion. The replacements appointed to fill the vacant command positions were younger, less experienced, and uniformly compliant. They executed orders without objection. The carrier moved closer to shore. The rules of engagement were implemented. The Marines deployed to forward positions. Operations continued, but the strategic questions that had prompted the resignations remained unanswered. What was the defined objective? What constituted success? What level of loss was acceptable in pursuit of goals that had not been clearly articulated? 6 weeks, 4 commanders, and a leadership crisis that raised fundamental questions about whether the military campaign was being driven by coherent strategy or by momentum and the reluctance to admit that current approaches were not working. The officers who resigned believed they knew the answer. The officers who replaced them were following orders, and the gap between those two positions defined the deepest crisis facing U.S. military operations.